Okay, so let's see. So welcome, Michael Muthukrishna. I'm so happy to be talking with you. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm very pleased to be chatting with you, David. It's nice to meet someone who's, in the sphere, so to speak.
Well, that's right. And so we're here to talk about your book, A Theory of Everyone. And I'm titling it A Theory of Everyone as a New Paradigm. So we're also going to be talking about the concept of paradigms. And when I talk about this, I say that even though the scientific revolution is 500 years old, there's two bodies of knowledge that are new within the last 50 years. The first is complex systems science, and that's new because it required the advent of widespread computing ability. The second is generalized Darwinism, and that's new because the study of evolution became constricted to genetic evolution until about the 1970s and didn't expand outward until the last 50 years. And you're such an embodiment of that because I regard you as a third generation generalized Darwinist, coming from a distinguished lineage, academic lineage that includes Pete Richerson and Rob Boyd, Joe Henrich, and others. And so I'm really eager to hear you talk about your own experience as a person entering the field at this time when Darwin's theory of evolution, having already proven itself within the biological sciences, was now boldly expanding to cover all Darwinian
Yeah,
processes.
yeah, yeah.
So let's begin with that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you very much that it is a very exciting time to be kind of in the evolutionary sciences. So the title of the book is it sounds a little immodest, but it's really a play on a theory of everything from physics, right? The idea is that we have evolutionary theory as a new bedrock for the human and social sciences. And when sciences discover that kind of bedrock, it really helps you sort the sense from the nonsense. It really helps you start to accumulate in a way that is really productive, I think. And that's where we're at. I'm not sure. The question was quite general, David. There's two directions I could go in. One, I could say how we got here, in particular in my neck of the woods in cultural evolution, and where we could be headed, or was there something else you wanted to talk about?
Well, I think a little bit of your personal story is useful to illustrate a general point
Oh, okay.
because
Yeah, of
I think
course.
there's Dennis Snower and I distinguish what we call diffuse pluralism. Diffuse pluralism is many schools of thought with many islands of thought with little communication among islands, and I think that in the absence of a integrative theory, then all of the branches of of humanity become a kind of a diffuse pluralism,
Hmm.
and and so you can be transdisciplinary, but without something holding it all together, without some integrative framework, then that's what's needed. And I think we could talk about that in the abstract, but I sense that that's what you experienced as a student
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
with all
Absolutely.
sorts of fields. So in a sense, you were transdisciplinary, but then you became um, adopted the evolutionary perspective. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that provided a
Yeah.
kind of a intellectual glue or interlocking framework of ideas that tied all of these disciplines together. So that's how I see it. But and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what
No,
I'm
that's
eager
right.
to have
Yeah.
you talk about.
Yeah, no, that's right. So, I mean, when I was younger, when I was in high school, I did very well, and I could have gotten into any subject I wanted. And I wanted to lead a meaningful life, if you like. So I thought, I wanted to see if I can tackle a big question. And to my mind, the biggest questions I could see were, in fundamental physics, maybe in philosophy, maybe theology, or in human behavior. And I felt like, a lot of the biggest problems have been solved in physics. We were kind of at the margins where we could no longer test a lot of these things. I wasn't really satisfied with the answers you could get out of philosophy, so I thought human behavior. But my general approach is kind of to manage risk, if you like. And so I thought I should probably combine this with something that pays money. So I thought, let's do medicine or law or engineering or finance or something like that. And of those, it felt like engineering would probably be the most portable. I wouldn't have to take the bar in another country or something like that, right? But then actually, when I started taking psychology, I was actually deeply disappointed in that, it seemed to me that psychologists were asking probably the most interesting questions one could imagine. Why do we do the things that we do? Why do people behave the way they behave? But they were doing it in this way that didn't resonate with anything that I was learning about as an engineer. As an engineer, you need frameworks that you can rely on, that are ultimately, you are translating science into technology. You're translating science into real world application. You need to know that it's going to work. Like, you need to know that when you write those calculations down, that bridge is not going to fall down. When you write that software, the plane's not going to fall out of the sky. And so I was a little disillusioned, and so I started to take a lot of other subjects. I took biology, I took philosophy, I took economics, I took political science. I was really looking across, and it didn't seem like the problems that I was seeing in psychology, sometimes they were solved. Economists had more formal theory, for example. Political theorists, seem to have some of the similar problems around, I think political activism within their science, things like that. So I was really looking. Then I took an evolutionary psych class, and this to me seemed like the closest I'd seen. It was an attempt to take evolutionary theory and apply it to humans. So some of that made sense.
Who was your instructor, by the way? You were at UBC, University of British Columbia, is that right?
Yeah, so I actually took two courses. So I took Tom Sudendorf's course. That was the main evolutionary. So he's written this book on the gap. I don't know if you've seen this. So he looks at the gap between primates and humans. And I also took Bill von Hippel's course. So Bill had kind of just integrated it into this approach. And this was, if you want to, this was like very traditional evolutionary psychology. And what my take on it was, I was very excited because I thought, look, here we have a bunch of evolutionary theory. I could see it in the biological classes I was taking. And when you were applying something like, let's say parental investment theory to humans, I was like, that might actually work. That makes sense. But when you started to theorize beyond the biological models, when you started to go, okay, let's think about adaptation for what an ancestral environment looked like, I was like, I don't know, there's a lot of noise here. Do we really know what the ancestral environment looked like? And I guess the backstory to this, David, is that I lived in so many different places around the world. My family's from Sri Lanka. I grew up in Botswana, in Papua New Guinea. I traveled well beyond that. I was living in Australia at the time, and first off, the things I was hearing in psychology didn't always resonate around the world. I was like, look, people are not exactly the same, but eating different foods.
You lived the non-weird experience. Weird was embedded into your...
Totally. Yeah, exactly. And you know what? And the thing is, it was so hard to convey this because I was like, if you haven't experienced it firsthand, it's hard for you to understand really how different people's psychological software is and the norms that they're following. And the things you take for granted are not the same things that motivate other people. So the importance of status, the degree to which you can make individual level decisions without consulting with a wider group, how much conformity actually matters. All of these things are quite deep. And when you talk sorry, go ahead, David. You wanted to?
Well, yeah. Let me bookmark this because I think that what we're talking about. I just want to make it accentuate it a little bit more, is that in its early days, evolutionary psychology had much to recommend it, but also was highly gene-centric. These modules evolved in the Stone Age, and was thought to be culturally universal, human universals.
Yeah.
These are like the psychological organs, the world around, and culture was sort of marginalized from it, and then the lineage that you're going to get to was at that time quite separate, and so I think over the decades they've converged, and there's been a lot of progress. But I just wanted to provide that little commentary on what you've been saying. So now please continue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. And so I was satisfied with we need an evolutionary approach. This seems like the right thing to do, but I was dissatisfied when we were starting to think about this. And sometimes the evolutionary psychological answers were, look, humans have the Stone Age brain and they just adapt to police forces and governments. I'm like, but where did they come from? Where did the police force come from? How, and why does it seem to work better in some places than others? Like, I know there's differences in corruption, for example, which is, one of the things I ended up working on. So actually toward the end of undergrad, I was like, screw this. I'm going to do a dissertation focused on engineering. And, I'm going to take what I can from psychology. So I thought, cognitive psychology, low-level perception stuff, decision-making, this seems to be the most robust stuff. I'm going to move that, and I'm going to look at safety-critical systems. I was working on smart home technologies. And I was like, this is where I worked in a lab in human factors with a professor named Penny Sanderson on anesthesiology, of all things, so audio interfaces in anesthesiology. And then, as I was working on actually my dissertation in smart home technologies, I was using more control theory, which is the math of feedback loops. And this was the big breakthrough for me. I was like, wait a minute. If we can model feedback, then we can model social influence and mutual social influence. And maybe this could be a kind of basis for a science of culture, which to my mind didn't exist, right? So, my view of anthropologists at the time, which I now know is incorrect, was, folks who went traveling and wrote travel diaries. I was like, okay, ethnographies, all right. That was my impression as an undergrad. Anthropology class, I realize, is more to it right now, but I did a bit of education to get there. I was like, okay, whatever. So because I had this breakthrough, I was like, okay, I want to pursue this path. So my alternatives is go work for a big tech company or, do maybe more research on smart homes, but I'm going to pursue this path. I want to see if it'll work. So being the naive undergrad that I was, I went into Google and I typed psychological foundations of culture because I was like, that's what I need to model this. And I accidentally came across an edited volume by Mark Schaller, an evolutionary psychologist at the University of British Columbia, which I didn't really know much about, to be honest. And so I emailed Mark out of the blue and I was like, Mark, this is my background. This is what I want to do. I think culture is super important to human behavior. I'd like to understand. I'd like to model it. Are you taking PhD students? Could I meet you? So he said, he was on sabbatical at the time. He said, I'd love to. You sound really interesting. But I think you really ought to meet Joe Henrich and some of my other colleagues. And I was like, Joe Henrich, okay, I don't know who this guy is. So I'm Googling, Joe Henrich. I'm like, oh, he's an anthropologist? Weird. He's in the departments of psychology and economics. I'm like, okay, economists I understand, and psychology.
Actually,
Okay,
he has a background. He has a background a bit like yours, didn't he? Wasn't he in
He
engineering
did.
and
He
stuff
was an
like that?
engineer. Yeah, he was an aerospace engineer. So I thought this is really nice. So I flew to the U.S. on work, and I rerouted in this ridiculous manner through Vancouver to fly home, so that I could meet Joe and and Ara and R&R and Zion and Steve Heine and who anyone else who'd meet me. And really, it was my meeting with Joe that I was like, okay, this is where I want to be. So there's a few things. The first was I realized there was this whole body of work that had been going on alongside evolutionary psychology that had nothing to, it was a separate lineage altogether that was grounded more in these models and would continue to build on it, not as an analogy, but really an extension of evolutionary biology. And I was like, okay, that's exciting. And the second was, I think Joe, there was a resonance in the way that Joe and I thought about the world that I think came from our engineering training, which was that a lot of the time when you're a scientist, you work on a part of the world. You work on bromeliads or something, and you focus on this one thing. Whereas if you're an engineer, you do work on a component, but you always have to zoom in and out because you have to think about how your component interfaces with the bigger system, and you make sure that it's never completely encapsulated. There's always this spaghettification. So you always have to think about it. You have to zoom in and out. And Joe was doing that for human behavior.
Well, we have a mutual colleague in Guru Madhavan, um, and I have a podcast with him, which is titled Systems Engineering as Cultural Group Selection. And I think that when you look at systems engineering, it actually is a very refined form of cultural group selection, and must be, because how are you going to engineer
Absolutely
a complex system other than evolving it? And so that connection is something that you're talking about, and that I explore with Guru. So please continue, and then we'll I want to set, go ahead.
It's a long-winded story, but anyway, so I knew I wanted to work with Joe, and so I applied, and I guess it was mutual. So I got in, and I was always I'm a risk. Not risk averse, but I'm risk managing kind of person. So I kept the engineering skills alive just in case this all went south. And I started working in this area. And as I read through the models and as I, began to work in this area, I realized this was a way to integrate, the social sciences, the human and social sciences. This was a bedrock that we could start building on. In the book, I use the analogy of our solar system, so orbital mechanics. So, under the Ptolemaic model, going all the way back, we had a model of the solar system where the Earth was in the center, and the sun and all the other bodies in what we now call the solar system were rotating around the Earth, orbiting the Earth. And actually, that model was very predictive. It was highly accurate. And the reason it was accurate was because it had little compensations. It had these little epicycles. It had circular orbits with little epicycles around it. And when when Copernicus came along and he said, actually, we're going to put the sun in the center, his model wasn't much better. And the reason was he still had circular orbits, so he still had these little epicycles to correct for it. And it was only when Kepler came along and said, the sun is in the center, and we have these elliptical orbits, that it was like, oh my God, we can model this in a much simpler way and retain all of that accuracy. And that's how I kind of saw dual inheritance theory, this idea that humans are governed by, genes and culture. I was like, yes, actually, we can build models, so economists can build models, but they constantly have to build in epicycles. They constantly have to put these little compensations in because they don't have the right model of the human. They don't have the right model of our social systems.
Well, that's a perfect segue to dual inheritance theory, because I think that, let me just gather my thoughts here. We'll excise this just a minute. Okay, so that segues to dual inheritance theory, just where I wanted to go. And I'm fascinated by this idea that what we see in the about the world depends on how we think of it and how we process it. And I think that dual inheritance theory really helps us get at that. The idea that our symbolic systems are the cultural equivalent of our genes, and so that means that although so the way I put it is that we all have a collection of genes, our genotype. Those genes influence just about everything that could be measured about you, your phenotype. We also have a collection of symbols. We call it our symbotype, which also influences just about everything that could be measured in you. And both our genotypes and our symbotypes lead to repertoires of behaviors. They result in a degree of flexibility, but to go beyond that repertoire, we actually need to change either the genotype, there must be genetic evolution, or there must be symbolic evolution. And of course, symbolic evolution can take place within a person's lifetime much more than genetic evolution. But for me, this has tremendous metaphorical transfer to think of our symbolic systems as the cultural equivalent of our genes, and helps me to think about this fascinating concept that as Einstein put it, the theory decides what can be observed. Something can be obvious, invisible, or wrong. It's out there, it's right in front of your face, but whether you see it or not depends upon the symbolic system that you have. And so I'd just love to have your thoughts on all of that. Speak to us about like dual inheritance theory as you understand it.
Yeah, so I'm a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet guy. Like I don't really worry too much about what you call it, but the basic idea is this: we are a new kind of animal whose behavior and social systems are governed by millions of years worth of genetic evolution, thousands of years worth of cultural evolution, and a short lifetime of experience. And when we think about, and I, as an engineer, I really think about all three of these as control systems or reinforcement learning systems with a different lag or delay and a different way of storing that information. But ultimately, just trying to adapt to an environment or a range of possible environments that the organism has to deal with. And that's everything from, like if I pick up a coffee, I have a bunch of reinforcement learning going on in my brain in order to have learned how to do that. When I was a toddler, I had to do it like this. And to, the fact that caffeine acts on receptors in my brain, blocking it and, allowing me to go for longer.
You were drinking coffee as a toddler there, Michael, were you?
I wasn't drinking coffee. I don't think it was. Just one of the components, the milk, I think.
With both hands, with both hands.
Yeah, with both hands. I grabbed my mom's cup. No. um, but yeah, so the point is that there are these systems, and they're really just they're integrated with one another. They're trying to adapt, and I do find that to be a powerful, not a metaphor per se, but
Yeah,
a powerful
not a
tool for
metaphor.
thinking. A powerful tool for thinking. Because it really is happening. It's not a metaphor. It's really happening. So, and I should say, David, I didn't say this before, but what was motivating me was the application of this science. Like, at the end of the day, I think I still am an engineer of sorts. I want to apply it in the world. And so I wanted the science to be right because I wanted to be able to trust it so that we could, engage with policy and solve some of the problems that I didn't think were being solved based on ideology or a poor model of the world. And that included, conflict as I could see it, but also the after effects of climate change. So adapting to a climate changed world, mass migration. Can we govern ourselves under those circumstances? That kind of thing. And actually, I should say, I just came from a meeting with the UNDP. In their latest Human Development Report, cultural evolution and an evolutionary approach is deeply integrated.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, so 7 of my papers are cited. And I think Joe Henrich has a little piece on it, and I mean it's wonderful how far this field has come in terms
No,
of
I do
application.
believe that there's a catalysis in progress. We'll actually get there in this interview.
Yeah, yeah. So listeners, please go check out the 2024 HDR Human Development
We'll
Report.
provide the link to it. I want to ask you something about dual inheritance theory that's on my mind, and to make a distinction between kind of macroevolutionary approaches to it and microevolutionary approaches to it. And my perception is that a lot of the work on dual inheritance theory is quite macro. It has to do with Peter Turchin's work and Ed Slingerland's work, 10,000 years of history, the axial age, and
Yeah,
all very good. But when you approach the same topic at a very micro scale, an individual scale, then what you want to be doing is studying a very tight dialectic between the individual person and their social milieu and their environment, really fast pace. And other disciplines come into play like therapy. And because that's what therapists do, they're attempting to work with their clients in order to change the way they think, in order to change the way they act. And so there's a whole realm of inquiry that needs to be done at the micro level in addition to the macro level.
yeah.
And I perceive that as like a new frontier, not much work done there yet. Do you agree? And can you point to any studies by yourself or others
Yeah.
that actually
Yeah.
approach dual inheritance theory at a micro scale?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is I was looking forward to this podcast because no other podcaster would ask me that question.
That's true.
and I do agree. I do very much agree. So I think in part because of the origins of the models in population genetics and where we've got so far, we're developing ultimate level theories, macro evolutionary theories, and some of them do have low-level implications. So, models of social learning, for example, or social learning strategies. They are kind of micro. But what I think we need is really something closer to kind of the economic toolkit, kind of a utility maximization kind of thing. But the difference, I think, is that it's constrained by the ultimate framework. It's constrained by what is realistic. So if I were to give you one example of that from my own work, and I agree with you, this is really in its infancy. So we have a model of corruption of multiple scales of cooperation. We have a few, but in one empirical paper where we built a model first, we were looking at how can direct reciprocity undermine institution level cooperation. And so what we model this with a public goods game. And of course, if you just have a standard model of a public goods game, for listeners who don't know, this means that every person has some endowment. They put some money into a public pool. It's a little bit like paying your taxes, and then that pool is multiplied by some amount and distributed equally to everyone. So it's non-excludable. It's a bit like everyone pays their taxes, and then we all enjoy clean water and clean air. It's like that. So anyway, so when you do this, what you find is that in the absence of some kind of countervailing force like punishment, people at first will play at the norm of their society, and then it collapses to not contributing anything, and the Nash equilibrium is in fact not to contribute anything, and free ride on everyone else's behavior. So if you're doing a stranded economic approach, you might try to fix that with a variety of things. So punishment is classic, but Ernst Fair has a model where he tries to fix it with inequity aversion. So he says humans care about fairness, and they care about it in a symmetrical fashion. Why? Because this is what he sees in his society. He says people care when you get more than me, and I care when I get more than you. That's patently absurd, right? And it's absurd if you just go around the world. It is true. In a lot of places, people do care if I get more than you, but in many places, they do not care very much at all. They only care if you get more than me. So you've kind of fixed it in that now you've shown that there are different stable Nash equilibrium. But where did that come from? It doesn't make sense. You have to have another force evolving those fairness norms. You have to have something else driving that to explain the variation that we see in our societies. So that's that intersection, I think, between the ultimate level models. So, for example, how the market might shape people's fairness norms, because in order for a market to work, you have to have a somewhat equitable exchange. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses. So when I talk to my colleagues in economics, I kind of describe it as we're further disciplining the model. We're putting further constraints on it, but those constraints don't come from my life experience. They don't come from something I just made up or what made the mathematics easier to model. They come from evolutionary theory, these selection pressures that we see across the world. Now, that's still not micro enough for me, at least. There's still that applied angle. It's like, okay, well, what? Fine, you've got still a very abstract model of how different scales of cooperation can undermine one another. And from that body of work, you could come up with somewhat general principles of, if you want the higher scale to succeed, you need to incentivize alignment between scales. You need to undermine lower scales if they're out of alignment. So in other words, where the incentives are mismatched, you have incentive incompatibility. But how do you do that in practice? Like, what are the actual levers of change? So for humans, you mentioned one, therapy is one, movement of social norms might be another, behavioral science techniques, everything from, nudging to thinking through the systems that people find themselves in and how you can move those systems around to get people to behave more pro-socially. There's a variety of techniques, but when you're in the mud, when the tire meets the tarmac, now the analogy that I use is it's the relationship between an evolutionary biologist and an ecologist. Like, yes, ecology has some issues in the sense that, things are difficult to model. There's a lot of problems. There's theory that needs to be built out. But imagine if you were an ecologist and you had no understanding of evolutionary theory. You had none of you'd be seriously screwed. You'd be trying to, how many foxes are there? What's the water pathway? How many squirrels are there? It's
Well,
numbers,
that's the way
and
it
now you're
was.
trying to
That's the
empirically.
way.
I know
That's
that's
the way it was.
You're just counting, and you're empirically trying to discover these relationships.
Yeah.
It's a very different world if you have Locke-Volterra equations, and at least you have something to understand such a thing as a predator-prey system, or that there are these evolving patterns over time. So that's where I think we ought to go in application.
Yeah, and so you've already touched upon the basic dynamics of multi-level selection, which it's just so foundational, this idea. And the way you put it in your book was what destroys high scales of cooperation evident in a peaceful, prosperous society is lower scales of cooperation. In other words, cooperation is both the problem and the solution. And this is so fundamental. If you don't understand that basic multi-level dynamic, you just can't get going. And yet so many people don't, in part because the topic has such a controversial history within biology, which is no help.
Right.
And there's other reasons why this basic, I call it the perverse alchemist that turns gold into lead. So, self-preservation, a good thing, becomes self-dealing. helping family and friends a good thing becomes nepotism and cronyism, all the way up to growing the economy overheats the earth. And so if, I'd love to hear it in your own words, what this multi-level dynamic is, how you um, describe it to others, and
Yeah.
how you see it as, why is it new? Because you don't really see it.
Yeah.
There's this huge need for basic literacy on this topic, is what I find, and I'm
Yeah.
interested in your own experience.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I, I started thinking about it through the lens of cooperation, and because, it's one of the things I work on. And um, I guess I first started thinking about it because, I started my PhD in 2010, and I read this paper from 2005, not too long before then, which was Science's list of the top 25 big questions in the coming quarter century. And cooperation was one of them. And so there's different mechanisms that people had identified, but they weren't thinking about it in a multi-level way. They were just identifying mechanisms that could sustain cooperation. Inclusive fitness, direct reciprocity, reciprocal altruism, indirect reciprocity, reputation, institutions, they're just, and even religion, identifying these mechanisms. But I stopped and I was like, wait a minute, guys. All of these mechanisms, these levels, if you like, exist at the same time, right? And this isn't a human society problem. This is across biology. This is true. You are, yes, we're an organism, but you're an ecosystem. You're an ecosystem not only because you have a microbiome in various different parts of your body, but also you are multiple cells working together. And when one of those cells decides, I care about me more than I care about the whole, we call it a tumor. We call it a cancer. We are constantly at war with lower levels of cooperation. Bacteria, viruses, germs. We're constantly at war with this, and we're also at war with similar scales of cooperation. So when I saw that, I was like, this is some low hanging fruit. The fact that we hadn't thought about how these different scales interact with one another. So that was where that paper in Nature Human Behavior came from. I was like, okay, let's set up the perfect institution. The one that everybody thinks that if we could set this up in Afghanistan or Liberia or wherever, this is going to work. We're going to set it up. And we're going to set it up in the game where we give, effectively frictionless leadership power to the person. And we show the more you give power to that person in this game environment, the more cooperation you get. Yay! But you're not thinking about those multiple levels. You're not thinking about the bacteria. You're not thinking about the tumors. You're not thinking about that. So all we did was we made one small change. We said, hey, leaders, if you'd like, you can punish people. Sorry, let's go back to players. Players, if you like, you can contribute to the public good or keep for yourself. Or, if you'd like, transfer some money to the leader. We're not calling it anything, but you can do that. Or to any player, I suppose. And leaders, you can punish people or not punish people. And you can also accept that money if you'd like. So what do you find? Well, the stronger you make the leader, the more likely they are to accept the payment and punish people for not giving them a payment, not for not contributing to the public good.
Welcome
So,
to authoritarianism.
exactly. Very small shift. It's like Putin makes more money by, extracting a little bit from everybody than, making sure that the economy does well, And this is a story we see all over the world. And so it was just a demonstration, and since then we've had a bit more work on this. It's a demonstration of you have to think about these scales of cooperation as an engineer would, as a systems scientist would, as part of. You cannot just zoom into one level and say I've solved it. You have to think about the fact that we live in a world where we play multiple games, we belong to multiple groups, we cooperate using different mechanisms with different payoffs, and I mean, to me that's not. It's so fundamental that it's unignorable. Like, you can't make progress if you're not thinking in this way.
Well, also it needs to have a huge intentional component, because if multi-level cultural evolution will take place whether we want it to or not, and if we're not intentional about it, then it will result in lower scales of cooperation that will be disruptive at higher scales. We can guarantee it. And so that means that what policy is, I think, what all of our intentional change efforts should be regarded as a form of conscious multi-level cultural evolution. And the evolution then
Yeah.
takes the form of decision making. It's less of a raw process of some groups failing and others. That takes place also, but really it's in our decision making and our policy making and the experiments that we perform and so on. So I see it
Yeah.
using the term niche construction, which is one of our key words, um, that what we need to construct is like a worldwide cultural inheritance system that employs variation, selection, replication processes at multiple scales and contexts, all coordinated with the global good in mind.
So yeah, so the way I think about it is I think the intentionality it provides mutation as well, so it provides new possibilities. We're thinking about that. They still have to compete with one another. So if one company says I'm going to share profits with the employees at a ratio of 70-30, and another company says, actually, I'm going to, take it 70-30, but for the CEO and leadership team and much less. These are the kinds of policies one can set. The second thing is that, I don't think we never really designed anything. There was design, but the design was providing those variation. These things evolved. Democracy evolved. The American experiment could have been a failure. Many other experiments were. There's many communities that started off as anarchist and they just disappeared, for example. Or the communist experiments disappeared. If communism had succeeded the way that the American experiment had, then we would be talking about how, every country ought to be integrating these things. But they're trying different things. And so that's another place you can be intentional about. You can design your system in a way that at the moment accidentally got there, where the way I call, I refer to it as you fail locally and you learn globally. That's how you kind of create.
But that too, Michael, I agree totally. And there's all kinds of natural variation to draw upon, huge fields of natural variation. But unless you actually can notice all of those, compare,
Yeah,
pick what works, replicate
correct.
it.
That's
So
true.
so I think even
You need a structure to do that.
even the
Yeah,
point that you make about natural variation requires a structure in order to complete the inheritance system. Otherwise, you get just
agreed.
variation. So
Agreed. No, agreed. So for example, if a bacterium comes up with an essential mutation that would be very helpful for us, we don't benefit from it unless it manages to, inject itself into our bodies. I agree with that, so in the book I use examples, as you know, of where this has worked and how we might take it elsewhere. So I use the United States as an example. So Justice Brandeis referred to each state as a laboratory,
yep.
and it's true. Every state tries different things, and if it doesn't work, I'm sorry, Arizona, it didn't work out for you. And if it works, other states can learn from it, or it can bubble up to the federal level. Under Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, Microsoft turned from this monolith
Yep.
where really the
Hit
components were
refresh.
at each other's throats. Exactly, refreshed, exactly as his book said. It became an ecosystem of startups. The way that Silicon Valley works, where they were working together, learning, trying, failing locally, bubbling up globally.
Well, this
And
might
so
go ahead. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
so I was just going to say that one of the things I'm involved in as well is the Charter Cities Institute. I prefer the terms startup cities than charter cities because the charter is very economically, Paul Romer emphasizes the institutions, but a startup is more than its rules. It's also its culture. And there, the idea is that there are, I think, something like 200 new cities all around the world. And what we want to do is set up a learning platform and get involved in the governance so that they can learn from one another, effectively act as different states. Like Hong Kong was this engine of development for China that was then replicated in Shenzhen and Guangzhou, and they attempted to do that in other places. So there are cities that, we're involved in Zanzibar, for example, that are really using this multi-level process as a way to redesign politics and governance, because you have a path dependence problem otherwise. You've gone down this path and now you're stuck, and how do you reintroduce that diversity but also make sure that learning spreads through the system?
Yeah.
There's more I
Yeah.
can say on that, David.
Yeah, no, so we'll get back to it. But I think this brings us back to paradigms, because I'm doing this also, and including some of the progressive business movements like conscious capitalism and B Corps, and just did podcasts very recently, within the last couple of weeks, with leaders of both of those movements. And here's what you find, Michael. First of all, you find these experiments that they work really well. And in the case of B Corp, it's quite systemic. You're familiar with B Corp, I think you know. I mean, they're very systematic in what they in what they do. And yet at the same time, the whole model is so different compared to the neoclassical economic model that it's forever kind of dumbfounding, why this works. And Bob Chapman, who's the head of Barry Wehmiller, in his book with Raj Sisodi on his manufacturing firm, Everybody Matters, is an example of this, where he has this fabulous, successful model. Not only does it work for himself, but his company has acquired over 140 other companies and turned them all around. And then all these business leaders come to observe what he's doing. And in his own words, they say, I've never seen anything like this. And the reason for that is not because it's not out there. It is out there. In fact, it's hiding in plain sight, but they can't see it because of the ideas and basically the shareholder value model that's inside their head. What makes sense to them is something like force distribution ranking. Because why not identify the best individuals and reward them and get rid of the others? Because that's what makes sense against the background of a certain form of mentality. And so even though these examples exist, seeing them for what they are is huge. It's huge. The paradigm, the lens through which you look at it makes all the difference. And that brings us back to dual inheritance theory and symbotypes, and the theory decides what can be observed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is that I'm not an intelligent designer in the sense that I don't. I think we can amplify things that seem to align with the theory, and we know that they seem to be working. But I think in an ideal world, I would like the market to be able to sort this stuff out. But there are frictions, I think, that prevent the market from doing that. There's distortions, that prevent it from doing that. Some of it is a path dependence problem. Some of it is a delay and a lag on the learning. So, one example that you mentioned that I use in the book is the rank and yank. Famously, Enron used rank and yank. It wasn't the only company by all means, but it was in part because Jeffrey Skilling, the CEO, his favorite book was the Dawkins, The Selfish Gene. And so he thought that evolution was all about selection. It was all about competition. And he didn't, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. He didn't realize that it's also about diversity, and it's also about cooperation. Cooperation and competition are two sides of the same coin. But it took a long time for Enron to fall. And then again, it's not clear why it fell, like which attributes should I copy. Now, it could be that the market does sort it out, but it can take a long time without that intentionality or that framework to kind of guide you. Science, the social sciences, and certainly my field, psychological behavioral sciences, suffer from the same problem. You're trying to discover how the world works through RCTs, experiments, but without a theory, you don't know how to aggregate that knowledge.
Yeah.
You don't know how to learn from what actually worked and what actually was best, and the signal to noise is very low. Even though there is signal there, without the right lens, without the periodic table to see that what you're doing over there, that is a false start that looks like trying to turn lead into gold. And you see that other thing? That's more like gunpowder. That's more like actual stuff that aligns with collision theory and the periodic table.
Well, one thing that the market thinking does is and for example, the idea of creative destruction is that it implicitly assumes that selection only takes place at the corporate level between corporations. So the better corporations replace the worse ones. It's ignoring the selection that takes place within corporations, and which is of the disruptive variety. But I want to turn Michael to another.
Sorry, David, if I can say one more thing there, and that's another example actually of how the incentive structures or the systems we create affect the evolutionary process. Because
Totally.
One of the reasons that California is as innovative as it is because they don't enforce non-compete agreements. And so as a result of that, what is happening within the company can spread.
Yeah.
It's like bacteria learning from one another with horizontal transmission.
Yep.
And so if you want to poach an idea, you poach the team of people. And so it results in this very rapid means of cultural evolution.
Yep. That's all great. We could talk for hours, Michael, but I wanted to bring up the key concept of energy, which is a major part of your book, and to have you describe why this is such a key concept, and then I want to draw you out
Yeah.
on the concept of human energy. But first, why do we need to know about energy? Why is that such a key concept
Yeah.
of your book?
So the way again I came to this is through cooperation. And so if you for where I was previously, where I said, okay, so the lower scales undermine the higher scales, right? The you can often be trapped in a suboptimal equilibrium. You can be in a country where the state cannot provision for you, so you have to rely on friends and family. But that means when you become minister or president or shopkeeper or manager, you have to provision your friends and family, and that undermines the state. You're trapped. It's a kludge. It's a political kludge. So how did humans break out of this? How do we break out of this? So I started looking through, the metrics, all of the numbers on human progress, and there's a really interesting pattern that you see. We seem to break out of these lower scales. We seem to break out of these games when the environment actually shoves us into a positive sum situation. Now, there are potential positive sum situations, but the payoffs can actually change over time. And what do I mean by that? So when we model this, when we're trapped in our models, we model it as a dilemma. What is good for me is better than what is good for you. But in the real world, those payoffs are constantly changing, and they depend in part on the reward that I get from cooperation. So, I found the stag hunt, like the assurance game, to be a much better model for thinking about multiple different equilibria. So you can imagine hunting for hare by yourself, or working with other people to hunt for stags, or one could imagine, so in a new paper, we generalized the stag hunt to multiple players and multiple kinds of game. We could work together to get a blue whale, or coal, or oil and natural gas, or nuclear. So I started reading into energy budgets in the biological literature and the energy sciences, and I was looking at these numbers, and it lined up perfectly. So I guess the end of the story is that we shoved ourselves, we incentivized scales, we incentivized the possibility of scales that were higher than friends and family when we discovered stored sunlight in the ground. Millions of years worth of, photosynthesis turning peat to black rock that we call coal, cheap and available in the country that I live in, the United Kingdom, that allowed them to create a big empire. Because, I call this the law of cooperation because it's so obvious, really, is that the scale, the optimal scale of cooperation is the one where my share of whatever reward we get by working together is larger than it would be in a larger group or a smaller group. So, if we're doing an academic paper and I want to win a Nobel Prize or something, I want to build, if I'm a physicist, I have no choice but to work with thousands of others because I need a large hadron collider. If I'm a mathematician, maybe I can just work all by myself and I only bring someone else on because now I have to share the credit. Similarly with a company, like I want my company to be the right size. Like I can't do it all on my own. I need enough people that I have a decent chance of capturing that, that part of the TAM, like, the market. But when I divide up the returns per person, in expectation, it's going to be higher than if they had taken a salary job elsewhere or in a smaller group.
Well, let me actually push back. Let me push back against that a little bit because I know as a biologist that some of the best forms of cooperation comes in marginal environments, and so what you have is not an abundance of resources, but it's cooperation that creates the abundance of resources. So how do I square that with what you're saying?
There are four things that I say. The energy, the efficiency, or the technologies that you use to access things, the cooperation, and the evolutionary process. So sometimes you can find yourselves cooperating. You're almost at this new margin, but by working together, you actually do raise the per person level. So even in these marginalized environments, if you were better off doing it on your own, you would. But you have no choice but to work with others because your return is actually higher. For humans, hunter-gatherers are a good example of this, especially in marginalized environments. Though hunter-gatherers engage in not large scale, but this very kind of egalitarian motive, I think in part because the alternative in this kind of zero-sum environment would be at each other's throats. So again, this falls out of one of our models where there's two equilibria. One is we're in a zero-sum environment, your win is my loss, therefore we're just going to constantly fight and make sure there's no status, or we just have a status leveling mechanism. And just, sorry, to go back to the biology of this, if you look even in early life, and if you look at the role that energy has played, in the earliest life, of course, all we had was gravitational energy of the moon, much closer to the Earth at the time, sloshing the waters back and forth, and volcanic heat and the heat of the sun. Eventually, you get proto-photosynthesis and photosynthesis. And this allows you to kind of move at plant pace. And that opens, because of that stored energy, those sugars, ATP, because of that, it opens a new space for biology, a new kind of organism that doesn't move at plant pace and directly convert the sun into energy, but eats the stored packets of energy that it finds. And that's the same pattern we find across the human story, be it companies or countries, with access to energy. It's not that with access to energy you therefore cooperate. It's that with access to energy, the potential scale of cooperation is higher. But you could be the DRC, where actually a smaller group of foreign companies can come in and use your resources, cooperating with local elites at a scale that cannot be outcompeted by the population. But if you've got this kind of proto cooperation going on, and you've got this kind of evolutionary mechanism, then you can see new forms of cooperation emerge.
Yeah.
So two examples of that. One is the Maghrebi traders in the Mediterranean, these Jewish traders. So prior to that, cooperation was at the level of kin. You had to know someone in order to, how could you trust them otherwise? But because it opened up these new spaces of trade, they tried something new. And that was to manage reputations beyond kin and share those reputations. They moved to indirect reciprocity. Now, the background to that story is that only if it worked, like only if the payoff was high enough, would we be talking about the Maghrebi traders? And it was in that case. A similar story with colonialization. On the back of this cheap and available coal, you can industrialize, and then you can go after these rich but not as cooperative, smaller societies like Britain did, and you can be very successful. It's like the big organism eating the little organism. So there's a more complicated story between mutations that allow us to do more with less in terms of efficiency, the energy ceiling that puts a cap on the whole activity that I kind of call the space of the possible, and then the level of cooperation we find within that space, which does have a maximum limit. But as you're right, in environments where you're already cooperating, the only way to get by is to cooperate. You can see more cooperation, but they're interacting in complex ways that are ultimately through this evolutionary process.
Yeah, well, all good, all good. I don't see anything to disagree about here. I want to make one more pass through it, however, in let's say
Sure.
a practical business context, and to compare a group, let's call it a business group, and which is basically they don't have a strong sense of purpose. They're not well coordinated, and so basically nothing much is going to happen there. As opposed to one which is energized and well organized and so on, and they're spectacular. And so there's some burst of energy, which, just in everyday terms, in the second case, which does not exist in the first case, and so we could call that human energy. Some people do. Um, how does that fit within your framework? I mean, I think it should. So the concept that, quite apart from physical energy, there's some human energy that can be unleashed in a group that works well, and as opposed to a group that works poorly. Does that fit into your energy scheme? I really want to know.
I think about energy just literally in terms of watts and joules, but there are sometimes proxies to it. So just sorry to go back to your earlier point. In the Enron Corporation, right? It was in some sense an artificially created scarce environment, and as a result of that, you did see cooperation, but you saw people allying together to preserve their jobs. You saw cooperation actually less than what it would have been in this kind of abundance. But abundance also allows for waste. It allows you to be very excited, but also increase your diversity, try all kinds of failed strategies, and explore new spaces of possibilities. And it's actually the scarcity that kind of calls you to cut everything back, and you get this high selection pressure. So that, I think, is what squares the circle of what you were getting at. Now, how do I map that to what you're calling human energy? It depends what you mean. So if you mean like motivation, then it becomes a bit complicated because as I said, sometimes high selection pressure, in other words, falling energy, can be a huge motivator. And at the same time, possibilities created by new markets or the discovery of a new energy source or something like that can also be a huge motivator. So I don't think of them as the same thing other than they use the word energy. I mean, I want a common currency, and for me, that common currency is joules or watts or
Okay.
calories or whatever
All
you want.
right. Well, I
Yeah.
want to finish up with two questions. One is to ask you about the leading edge of academic research, and then the leading edge of practical applications. And of course, your engineering orientation is so great there because from the beginning, you've had practical applications in mind. So please comment with a emphasis on what you are doing, your own work, as to what's the leading edge of academic research and what's the leading edge of practical application.
Yeah. So obviously, I think the leading edge of academic research, in my view. So I think of academic research as also a cultural group selection competition,
Yes, yes.
and between disciplines, between paradigms, between ways of approaching the problem, and I think there are many exciting things going on. Um, some of it is about better theory in terms of dual inheritance theory and the way in which this way of thinking is penetrating other sciences. So, economists taking on board. I'm thinking of my colleague Tim Besley or Nathan Nunn, who was at Harvard and now at VSE, Vancouver School of Economics. The way that it's penetrating back into biology, and has for a long time through people like Kevin Lala, for example, formerly Kevin Leyland. And now the way it's also penetrating into policymakers and the way they think about the world. So be that charter cities thinking a lot more about the role of culture and kind of startup cities, or the UNDP or the World Bank, engaging with this kind of science. So I think the best way to critique is to build a better model. It's not to just like lay out the critique. You can do that as well, but I think if you provide an alternative, it's compelling. It's as Joe said, actually, Joe Henrich said in the UNDP in his little article. He said economics is built on a large framework of mathematical modeling that has made it quite powerful. So is dual inheritance theory and cultural evolution, except the dual inheritance theory and cultural evolution is built on first plausible principles for human behavior, and that makes it different.
Well, there's a whole
And
piece,
so,
Michael. Let me bookmark it. But there's a whole piece on the world nature of theory. Categorize it as like being different than evolutionary body. Of course, there's theory involved, but it takes a different form than.
sorry,
Go ahead.
David. Sorry, everything you said for the last minute or so was broken up. I didn't catch any of it.
Okay.
You said something. There's a whole body and something about theory.
There's a whole piece to be said about the that takes place in school economics, which dates back to physics of social behavior, something like Newton's laws
Okay.
of motions, as opposed to the kind of theorizing that takes place not only in evolutionary theory but for any complex topic, which is of a different sort. It consists of a large number of models, small world models, as Dennis likes to put it, and so on and so forth. So I think that's. I just wanted to
Yeah.
insert that
So
into a conversation. I suspect you agree, but
that's right. Totally agree. Totally agree. Yeah. I mean, so economics still has like, friction and elasticity. Is very much trying to build a physics of behavior, but we are not like, I joke with my brother who is a physicist. Your world is easy. Your planets, your particles behave the way you expect them to. The human world is not physics; it's biology. So the social world is biology. And so I think it was kind of a misstep. There's like a very generative body of obviously, but I think it's also we can create a merge or a marriage, if you like, that I think sets the path to be more straight. And there's other areas, by the way, just to be clear. I think there's the rise of big data, maybe AI. There are all these or large throughput experiments. There are all these very
well,
exciting
just a few
things that I
minutes
think
on
need
AI
to
because
converge.
on AI, I
Yeah.
think, and here again, I think we think alike. AI being always being some kind of evolutionary learning algorithm is subject to the iron law of multi-level selection. If you train AI models to accomplish some objective, and that's a lower level objective, unless you're coordinating that with some higher level good, it'll become part of the problem. I mean, it's just basic literacy about it. Multi-level selection is what's needed. Is it?
Yeah.
Yes?
So we're actually, this is a problem we're working on right now. It's, the AI alignment problem, as people call it. I said, we aligned humans. So how did we do human alignment? And let's think about that, because human alignment is about cooperation. How do we align AI in the same way? And it's exactly as you said.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
exactly as you said. So
So
I hate that it's obvious to you. Hopefully not obvious to everybody.
no, that's fine. I'm very happy to find someone I agree with on just about
Good.
everything. Well, tell,
David, sorry, I didn't get to say this, and you asked me, like, what about in terms of applied work? And I want to say this just in case, I don't know who your listeners are, but for me, it's finding the places where people have already bought into some portion of the paradigm, and I can move the needle a little bit, and then build up a body of demonstrations. So some of that might be the Charter Cities Institute. Some of it might be, what the British government is doing. Some of it might be, big policy stuff around climate change or UNDP or World Bank. Things where I think we can get people thinking about this, show that it works. Because if your theory doesn't work in the real world, it does not work at all.
can you
And
show?
I
Can
think
you give an
in that way,
example? Can you give an example of something that works in the real world?
in terms of see, this is the problem. So I think at the moment, no one has run that critical RCT that says this is the way you do it in the conventional approach. This is the way you do it from a kind of evolvability approach, if you like. Instead, what we have are retrospective studies. We say, look, this is how Microsoft worked. This is the way we do it at Charter Cities. This is whatever. This is how it could work. So I don't think we're there yet. I don't think anyone has shown that. But I think when that happens, when there's that impossible to deny test, and it's not that it hasn't happened because somebody tried and it didn't work. It just hasn't been attempted. Then I think the game changes again. And so that's really my hope with some of this work, for example, in Africa, where let's show it. Let's show it.
Yeah, but a little bit more about that work in Africa. What is that work in Africa? That's.
So in this case, there's a new city in Zanzibar called Fumba Town that's being developed. And because it's a new city, there's a possibility of running experiments, RCTs, at the border, playing out different strategies or finding a sister city and testing it in that way. So that work, I think, is very exciting. Because the UNDP has written about this work as well in this approach, there might also be ways to go, hey, let's try this in a kind of RCT manner where we can get at the causality and say this was the right framework.
Got it.
Otherwise, you're just in a marketplace of frameworks where some people find it useful, some people don't, but they still haven't begun to think about this kind of social alignment problem or this challenge of governance in the right way. And once it starts penetrating, it becomes obvious. There's lots of examples of it. Then I think people will demand it. They'll say, why are we not testing? Like, why are you, let me give you an example. In this country, everything is centralized. Why are you attempting to try a policy on an entire country that can take us into disaster? Why are you not trying several special economic zones around the country where you try it, see if it works, and then sell it to all of us? Because right now, there's a level of boldness that's required to put us back on the right path, and no one has it because they know that if they get it wrong, it applies to everybody. How can we do this model of, fail locally, learn globally? That's what we need. And when that becomes obvious, when everybody's saying that.
Okay, but the last thing, Michael. Words I should never use, but the concept of catalysis fascinates me. In chemistry, it means that the rate of a chemical reaction is not fixed, can be increased by orders of magnitude. And so then there's the idea of cultural catalysis. The rates of cultural evolution are not fixed, and that if we know what to do, we could have change in a matter of years rather than decades or not taking place at all. Do you think about cultural catalysis and how to achieve it?
Yeah, so I mean, if I remember my high school chemistry and biology, a catalyst or an enzyme is not used up in the process, but it speeds the process up tremendously. So, what is that thing that speeds everything up? At the moment, I feel a little used up. So I don't know if it's a person per se. I think it's I don't know if catalysis is the right framework. I think it's more like um, a runaway process, and maybe that could be the same thing, But how do you tip the domino so that it just there's no choice. The just simply social learning and simply there's money to be made. We have to do it this way. Takes over, and I really think it's just clear demonstrations that are unambiguous. So that's what I'm always on the lookout for. Listeners, if you have one, sell me on it. I'd be happy to help.
Well, I mean, the way I describe a chemical catalysis is the catalytic molecule grabs onto other molecules, holds them in an orientation that bonds them to each other, and it is released to repeat the process, sometimes replicating itself as a result. And so a cultural catalytic agent grabs other agents, holds them into an orientation where they bind to each other, and it's released to repeat the process.
Yep.
That's what it is.
Yes.
And I mean, this is a little catalytic moment right here. So I think that
Yep. Yep. Yep.
this gives me a lot of optimism that we actually can accomplish in years what would otherwise take place in decades and not at all. And by the way, Michael, multi-level selection is a good example of this. I have another initiative along with the New Paradigm Coalition called the Multi-Level Selection Initiative. If you look at the history of thinking about multi-level selection, the way you can describe it is an academic tragedy of the commons. It is a failure of the scientific process, and that's something that can be addressed. And so I think we have an experiment going on right now in terms of catalyzing awareness
Right.
of multi-level selection as foundational for the evolution of all pro-social behaviors. And we expect to do in years what as basically it's all trending in the right direction, but it's a decadal process. We don't have to wait decades and centuries for this, my friends. It doesn't have to be that slow. So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think, individuals certainly at an early stage who understand, who buy it and convert others into seeing things the same way. That's a kind of, it's a kind of catalytic moment where you're just building it out. It's all happening. And there's other spheres where I'm doing this as well. If you look at my website, my profile, you'll see it, with companies, with starting a new AI company, for example, like an AI training center. There's a whole bunch of things that we're just really trying to catalyze the whole movement, right? Getting.
Well, you've also I knew that I shouldn't use the word last thing, but you're at the London School of Economics, and you've built quite the program there for training people. I'd
Exactly.
like you to describe that a little bit. You're probably at the forefront
Yeah.
of graduate training and all of this. Tell us about that.
So this is a nice way to end it. So all of those frustrations that I had as an undergrad in psychology, I think one of the things I'm most proud about in my career is that I was able to fix it in a brand new undergraduate program in the department, which I was one of three professors in a nice moment where you have a lot of influence. To design a brand new psychological behavioral science program that is grounded in I teach the foundational course. They have evolutionary theory. They learn data science. It's useful. So they go all the way up to machine learning. They walk out of here, and the first generation have already gone on to banks, to work in data science, to do masters and PhDs and all kinds of things. But the key thing is that this stuff, the way that psychology is taught, is not trivia. It's not like, here's stereotypes, and here's social influence, and here's social persuasion, and somehow those are different things. It's none of that. It's integrative, and it's integrative because they get the foundational course from me through evolutionary theory. They know how to read the models. One of the admission criteria is a strong quantitative background. So we want high grades in mathematics or physics or some kind of course. And now I'm the new director of the PhD program. So again, it's an opportunity to. I've been released from my previous thing, if you want to use the catalyst metaphor, and now reattaching to something new to again revitalize it and help the students think through how can I be, because one unique thing about the LSE is we are not in it just for the sake of it. It's to know the causes of things for the betterment of the world is the motto. And so the PhD students we attract very much are of that kind, caliber. So it's like, here's a framework for how to think about your work that might allow you to go out there and apply it in a way that might have a better chance of working. So again, I've just taken on the position. This is my first year, so I'm very
Awesome.
excited.
Well, it's so great that you're working at the institutional level, as we know we must. And so I'm sure that's going to be a model, Michael, and for others to follow. Well, I think that is probably where we should stop.
David, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, thank you for having me on the show.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll continue to work together. Thanks, Michael.